Welcome in, everybody, to my second roster review for the 2022 CFL season. Hope you guys enjoyed my look at the Calgary Stampeders. If you missed that one, I'm going to create a playlist with all of these review videos, and so you guys can check that out whenever you like. And with that said, let's get on and talk about what we're going to be talking about today in this video. So first of all, we're going to be talking about what happened last year with Ottawa in terms of their 2021 outcome. And then we'll talk about the coaching staff that they're going to be bringing into the season this year. Then we're going to go into the 2022 positional rankings, which are basically going to be the bulk of this video. See where they stack up against the rest of the CFL at every position. And then going into their starting lineups, trying to piece together what players are probably going to be starting day one this year for this team, and then go into the team award predictions, and finally a key storyline to watch out for. And with that in mind, let's talk about their 2021 season. And honestly, it was just a dreadful season for the 2021 Ottawa Redblacks, much like 2019, where they just really struggled the whole season, particularly offensively. And 2 of their 3 wins came against Edmonton, who really joined them at the bottom of the CFL standings last year. And, you know, it's just a very unfortunate season for the Redblacks. They did finish on a high note, winning against Montreal in the season finale and kind of spoiling their opportunity to get a home playoff game. But other than that, there wasn't too much to take away from the Redblacks. You know, they're trying to bounce back this year and try to get back to the playoffs after missing the playoffs the last 2 years. Now talking about their coaching staff that they're going to be bringing into this season, starting with head coach Paul LaPolice, who has a 19-39 record as a head coach in the CFL. A lot of that is due to time he spent with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in the early 2010s, where it wasn't a very successful tenure for him there, but he later became a super successful offensive coordinator with that team, and he gets hired over here in Ottawa and had a rough first season with the team last year. I mean, he didn't really have a whole lot to work with, and I said that in last year's roster review. That team just was not very talented and experienced on paper, and that really was the result of the entire season last year. So I really don't blame Paul LaPolice. I think he's a good offensive mind, but this year is going to be super crucial for him, and he needs to put up some results. And in addition to his duties as head coach, he's also the offensive coordinator for this team, so he's going to be a huge factor in whether or not this team turns it around in 2022. He's also joined by defensive coordinator Mike Benavides, who's a very experienced coach in the CFL and should do a good job there. And then special teams coordinator Bob Dice, who did an excellent job last season. Special teams are really the heart and soul of this team the last couple of years and was the best performing unit on the 3 sides of the ball. So Dice, a great coach at what he does, and I think it's a pretty good staff, but there are questions about whether or not Paul LaPolice can produce as a head coach in the CFL. And now, without further ado, let's look at the positional rankings, starting with quarterback, which is going to come in at number 5 here in the CFL. And frankly, it's just because I just like other guys in the CFL a little bit more in terms of being high ceiling CFL quarterbacks. I do like Jeremiah Masoli. I think he is a very solid CFL starter, but there are things that I think are flaws to his game that I don't necessarily see too much with other guys. I consider Masoli a big-armed passer that generally makes very good decisions and works through his progressions. Sometimes he holds the ball a little too long, and in 2021, he didn't really use that improvisational off-script ability that made him such a dynamic quarterback back in like 2018, 2019, those years like that. And so I think that really limited his effectiveness last year. And frankly, my biggest problem with Masoli and why he doesn't rank higher in the CFL for me is his accuracy, which can be completely hit or miss, with some games consistently missing wide open receivers, such as week 15 versus Toronto last year, where it was just wide open receiver after another. He made the right read, it just, the throw just wasn't there. So I think on a consistent basis, just the accuracy is the biggest concern from a week-to-week basis. But I think other than that, he is very good at all the other aspects of playing quarterback in the CFL, in my opinion. So overall, I consider Masoli a very good quarterback that can sometimes play like a great one depending on the week. And that's just kind of who he is at this point in the CFL. But regardless, is a huge upgrade for the Redblacks going into this season from what they had in 2019 and 2021. Now, you also have a really interesting backup here in Caleb Evans, a second-year player that was forced into action during his rookie season and had his fair share of ups and downs which was to be expected, honestly. Evans certainly showed promise with a blend of elite athleticism and arm talent, and this resulted in some excellent splash plays. As a passer, he has a ways to go in terms of adjusting to reading coverages and making better decisions, but the athletic tools are certainly there in my opinion. You also have Taron Christian here, who spent last season as a backup and practice roster guy, and he played his college football at the University of South Dakota. And then you have rookie Tyree Adams here, a former indoor football league player who was a star at West Carolina, setting numerous school records in a prolific college career. So, interesting player here to compete for a backup job. Now looking at the running back position, which is also going to come in at 5th in the CFL, and really the only notable guy here in terms of guys that have carried the ball a lot at the CFL level is William Powell. He's an all-around back that can do a little bit of everything, but doesn't necessarily excel at any one aspect. One asset of Powell's game is he is a fluid pass catcher that can actually get out in the pattern and create plays in space. One thing to watch in his return to Ottawa is that Powell is getting up there in age. He's going to be 34 years old when the season kicks off, so that's certainly a concern whenever a running back gets into the early mid-30s. So that's a question, but he's certainly going to be the starting running back on this roster. And then free agent addition Jackson Bennett, who comes back to Ottawa after playing university football here with the GGs. Bennett is a Swiss Army knife type player that has shown throughout his football career that he's willing to do whatever his team needs. He's originally a converted defensive back from his time at the University of Ottawa, and then came and became a running back at the CFL level, and has been a useful spot starter at times over the last couple years in Hamilton. And he's obviously also a good special teams player as well, just a really good athlete to keep in this rotation here. I wouldn't expect him to kind of carry the load on offense, but you can occasionally start him. I think that was a really good free agent addition for Ottawa. And then veteran running back Brendan Galander's been here in Ottawa for quite a while, primarily been a special teams guy, but like Bennett, has been a useful part-time piece in the backfield at times. You certainly don't want Galanders to be your full-time starter at running back, but he can fill in for a game or two if needed. And then the last two guys here are mostly veteran fullback types. Marco Dubois, a special teams player that occasionally steps in to block or contribute in the check down passing game. And then Anthony Gosselin, mostly a special team fullback type, like I just said. Now let's talk about the rookie running backs. Starting with Devontae Williams, who's an undersized running back at 5'9", 170 pounds. He previously spent some time with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers but didn't appear in a game. Connor Ross, who's a fullback type from St. FX. Luca Perrier, an older rookie out of Laval, who's entering the CFL now at age 26. And then you have another fullback type in Mitch Rapper out of Carleton. Byron Marshall, a former star at Oregon, who spent multiple years on NFL teams and even saw some carries here or there, I believe, most notably for Washington. He spent last year's training camp with Hamilton, but was cut. And then Sergio Hoffman, a runner out of Portland State. We'll see if he makes the roster here. Now looking at the wide receivers, which are going to come in at 7th in the CFL, and this is no slight to them. Honestly, last year they would have ranked 9th in pretty much all of these categories. They were a dreadful offense on paper, so they've came a long way, and frankly there's just a lot of good receiving cores right now in the CFL. I had a really tough time putting those rankings together for that position. And so I think with this receiving room, what you have, and it kind of reminds me of the 2019 Winnipeg Blue Bombers that kind of did everything by committee. You didn't have one dominant receiver that, was a guy that you'd look at and be like, he's a number one target. But you have a lot of guys here with complementary skill sets, in my opinion. And let's just start talking about them. Let's start with Jalen Acklin, who I think brings more of that all-around ability to the table, and he'll be the guy that will have the best chance, I think, of becoming that number one receiver here in the Red Blacks offense. Acklin showed the ability to make plays in all areas of the field with Hamilton over the past 2 seasons and can line up in the slot or out wide. He's got good speed, has great hands, and can generate separation. However, I'm not sure if he has the game-breaking ability to be the centerpiece of a CFL passing game. I guess we will find out soon enough. He's joined by Darvin Adams, who's more of that perimeter receiver that can take the top off the defense vertically. Adams is capable of contributing in other ways as well, but will be best utilized as Ottawa's downfield passing threat. And I think that's really what he's become in the later years of his CFL career. Just a long time veteran here to bring into this receiving core. I'm very confident that he will produce for this team. And then RJ Harris, I gotta start off when I talk about him. He was just placed on this team's suspended list just the other day. I don't know if he's even going to play this year, but he's been a guy that has shown signs of being an impactful receiver over the past 3 seasons, but for one reason or another has never really developed into like a top 2 or 3 receiver on a consistent basis. Regardless, Harris is still likely to have a decent sized role if he does show up this season, and is at very least a very deployable option in this starting lineup. And then BJ Cunningham, who's just your classic pure possession receiver that will make tough contested catches, especially over the middle of the field. Did that a lot for Montreal over the last couple of years. Cunningham won't be the type of guy to create explosive plays all too often, but is a second down conversion machine that will be valuable to Ottawa. And then you got Ryan Davis, a guy that I'm super excited for, has a lot of upside, and will look to improve on an impressive rookie season from 2021. Davis possesses breakaway speed, and although his yards per catch does not look all that impressive from 2021, many of those receptions came on screens, thus lowering his average depth of target. In addition, Davis has also seen opportunities as a return man and may actually fill that role full-time this year. And then you got 3 Canadian receivers here, starting with Shaq Johnson, who comes over from the BC Lions. He's a guy that's shown flashes and is a starting caliber player, but not necessarily a star at the receiver position, at least from a Canadian perspective. Johnson wins primarily with his elite speed and has at times shown signs of being a good deep threat. What holds him back, though, I think, is his lack of physicality and contested catch ability, things that you just have to be a well-rounded receiver at the CFL level, but nevertheless a good Canadian starter here. And then Nate Bahar, who was a guy that had a breakout season of sorts in 2021, despite Ottawa's brutal quarterback play. More of a route runner, possession receiver than a guy that is going to generate big plays down the field, but I think he's a very usable player within this offense and may start. And then Levi Noel, who comes over from the Toronto Argonauts, an excellent special teams player that saw some starting opportunities in 2018 and 2019 with Toronto, but didn't necessarily see that much of the field on offense in 2021. So we'll see if he gets more of an opportunity here in Ottawa. And then Jordan Smallwood, a guy that saw some playing time in his rookie season last year, but didn't really make an impact. And then Terry Williams, a 5'9", 170-pound receiver who played in 2 games in 2022, but wasn't really too noticeable. So overall, I think this is a pretty good wide receiver room that kind of does things by committee. I think you could see where everybody's skill set kind of slots in here. I think you could see a guy like Ryan Davis really break out and become that star receiver in this unit, but right now I really don't think they have that designated number 1, which is why it only ranks 7th in the CFL. Now looking at Ottawa's wide receiver rookies, we'll start with Justin Hardy, a former 4th-round pick in the NFL by the Atlanta Falcons. He actually had a very productive career down there in the NFL. He had 9 career NFL touchdowns, and I believe over 1,000 career receiving yards. So he wasn't just a guy that was just a practice roster player down there. He actually played in NFL games. And then Keaton Brugling, the team's 3rd-round pick out of Carleton this year. His production in college wasn't all too impressive, but the athletic tools are there, which he showcased at the Combine. He should be a special teams factor from day 1 this year, but I think a couple years from now is when you're going to expect to see some production on offense from him. And then Brandon Arconado played football at Washington State and had a breakout final season with the team, which led him to becoming a guy that received pro interest. And then Ventel Bryant played his college football at Temple and received regular season playing time with the Dallas Cowboys in 2019. That's what he's done that's notable. And then Anthony Mahugo, a native of France who played in college for the Purdue Boilermakers. So a global that came through the American college system there. And then Sayosi Mariner, who played his college football at Utah State and spent some time with the Ravens in the NFL. So overall, with these rookies, there's a couple cool names, and I don't know if any of these guys are really going to make a huge impact this year, given all those veterans that we just discussed. Now talking about the much improved offensive line of the Ottawa Redblacks, and thank the Lord that they did something this offseason, unlike the BC Lions, who just kind of stood pat this offseason, but we'll talk about them when we have a chance to talk about that video. But the Redblacks aggressively pursued improving this offensive line this year, which was dreadful last year. But basically, you turn over every single starting position of this unit, starting with Ucombre Williams, a player that is very unique in terms of his ability to play both left tackle and center. You really don't see that combination all too often. He comes over from Calgary in free agency, where he was an excellent starter at left tackle, and I think he's going to assume the same role here. Darius Sirocco, another free agent addition here. He's another player with positional versatility after making the switch to center in 2021 after originally playing right guard in 2019 for Hamilton. He is a solid starter at center, however, I think his best film came when he was playing guard, if I'm being honest. However, given Ottawa's current depth, I think he likely slots in at center. And then Hunter Stewart, another free agent addition, a very solid but unspectacular veteran starter that still represents a major upgrade to what the Redblacks had at the guard position in 2021. He's not going to give you a ton of push in the run game. He's just not that dynamic, play strength dependent player, but has good pass blocking mechanics and has shown some good positional versatility throughout his career. Play a little tackle, can play a little center as well. So I think he's a really interesting player that can slot in multiple spots. Jacob Ruby, who was an interesting player in 2021 because he was kind of a castaway by the entire league after misrepresenting his vaccination status last year. So he was kind of cast away from the entire CFL. But previously, he developed into a rock-solid starter at left guard for the Elks, so I think he doesn't possess the highest upside, but he's still well-rounded in terms of his pass and run blocking, so I think this is a pretty good player and a guy that's still pretty young that can develop even more. And then Randy Richards, another one of these guys that was just added to the team's suspension list, veteran of the CFL who was out of the league in 2021 after briefly retiring. He has plenty of starting experience in the CFL, including starting in Grey Cup games, but he struggled in Toronto when I last saw him in 2019. And like I said, he was just added to the team's suspension list, so who knows if he's going to show up and play this year. And then these next guys I kind of consider developmental offensive linemen here for the Redblacks, starting with Jacob Zott, who is still a project at this point in my opinion after being forced into starting action in 2021. That being said, Zott should have more of an opportunity to learn this season with the veterans that the team has brought in here. Andrew Pickett, a very raw prospect that, like Zott, struggled when he saw the field in 2021. However, the difference with Pickett is that he's been in the CFL since 2018, but multiple season-ending injuries have caused setbacks to his career, and unfortunately that really showed up on the field when he saw the action last year. And then Katela Say, who was once a very well-regarded prospect for the 2020 CFL draft, he took a major fall on draft day, however, and fell all the way to the 8th round after being projected actually in the consideration for the number 1 pick. In his rookie season in 2021, he managed to get into the lineup for 5 games, of which he started 2. There's issues with his fundamentals like footwork, but the talent, in my opinion, is there. It's just, can you get something out of these raw tools that he possesses? And then Jalen Guthrie, another guy that played a few games last year and started a couple for Ottawa. Just not much to say about him. And then Dino Boyd, an interesting player here at the bottom, started 3 games last season, sliding into that left tackle position. But one of those games that Boyd started was against the Montreal Alouettes, where Ottawa allowed, I think it was 9 or 10 sacks. Regardless, I still think he may be a factor in terms of competing for a starting tackle job for this team this year, especially if Randy Richards doesn't show up. So overall, I think this unit is much improved, much like the rest of this offense. And so I think this is a really, really good unit going into this season, which could outperform this ranking, honestly. Now talking about the rookies that may contribute to this team on the offensive line, starting with the 2 guys at the top here, their top 2 picks from this year's draft in Zach Pelios and Cyril Hogan St. Don. Pelios, who was the 2nd overall pick in this year's draft out of Ottawa, he is a very smooth mover for an offensive lineman, and I think that's really what stands out about his game. And wasn't even invited to the National Combine originally. He actually had to go through the Regional Combine and just really impressed through all the testing there. And then Hogan St. Don, the team's 2nd round pick in this most recent CFL draft out of Laval. He's another guy who's a really good mover, had really good things like 3-cone times at this year's Combine, and looked really good in the one-on-one session there as well. Connor Bergluff, the team's 3rd round pick in the 2021 CFL draft, who returned to school and excelled at the University of Saskatchewan in his last year of eligibility. Matthew Dirks, another 2021 pick out of Delaware State, who was the team's 6th round pick in 2021. And then a couple Americans here, Jeremy Hickey, a 26-year-old lineman out of Eastern Michigan. Kyle McRory, a 6'3", 296-pound blocker who played for Southeastern Oklahoma State, which I really didn't know was a thing until I was doing research for this video. And then finally, Eric Starzala, who was originally drafted by Toronto in 2019, but has yet to play in a CFL game. Now flipping over to the other side of the ball with the defensive line, which is going to rank 7th in the CFL. And like a lot of these rankings that you've seen so far in this video, Ottawa would have ranked much lower last year. This team has actually improved substantially in terms of their overall talent on this roster, including this defensive line, which starts with Kwaku Boateng, one of their big offseason signings in free agency. Boateng, in my opinion, is a starting and sometimes star caliber Canadian defensive end who struggled with both production and impact in 2021 with Edmonton. In 2019, though, I thought he was one of the best defensive ends in the entire league, impacting the game regardless of whether or not his play showed up in the box score with things like sacks and tackles. Perhaps a change of scenery will get Boateng back to that elite level as perhaps the best Canadian defensive lineman in the CFL. And then speaking of Canadian defensive linemen, we got Cleon Lang here, who was one of the more disappointing players when I rewatched games from 2021. Lang is a multiple-time All-Star in this league at defensive tackle, but he just didn't make his impact felt that much last season. One can say that is due to playing on an awful Ottawa team. However, in 2019, he played on an awful Argos team, and I felt that he was one of the most impactful defensive players in the entire league. We still saw flashes of that dominant player in 2021, but the consistency was lacking from a down-to-down basis standpoint, so I think that can return with better players around him this year, but he's getting up there a little bit in age and will look to reclaim his status as one of the best Canadian and overall defensive linemen in the CFL this season. And then Davon Coleman, who is generally a productive starter at defensive tackle and was arguably this team's best defensive lineman last year. Coleman is a solid starter, but I don't know if he's really much more than that. You just don't see him make incredible plays on a consistent basis. It just doesn't stand out to you when you actually watch the defensive line play on a regular basis. So what I will say about him is he's more of a pass rusher than a run defender, so he will chip in terms of getting cleanup sacks on the defensive line. And then an interesting guy here is Lorenzo Malden, who has been a situational pass rusher and special teamer the past 2 seasons in Hamilton, where he has produced sacks and limited opportunities. He's likely in the mix to start opposite Boateng at defensive end this year, so this could be his big breakout season. He'll finally get an opportunity to start at the CFL level, so he's a guy to watch, definitely. I think he was a former third round pick in the NFL draft. And then praise Martin Aguike, a very intriguing athlete that made a handful of splash plays in his rookie season last year. Aguike is a guy that I think could have a breakout season this year. Again, one of those guys that's going to compete for that starting defensive end job opposite Boateng. And then Justin Thomas, a guy that's been on multiple CFL rosters the past couple of seasons and started games in 2019 for Toronto, but really didn't stand out in my opinion. So it's just unclear what you're going to get at this point from him. And then Kene Onyeka, a third-year player that started a couple games for Ottawa last season and came away with a couple of sacks even. He was selected by the team in the 4th round of the 2018 CFL draft. And then Nigel Romick, a special team standout that is one of the team's longest tenured players, but wouldn't expect him to start really on a game-to-game basis. So this deep into his career, I don't really expect him to be a breakout guy that can start for this team in their ratio situation. And then Rashawn Davis, a second-year player that dressed for a couple of games in his rookie season after being the team's 7th round pick in 2020. He'll be competing to be depth behind Boateng at defensive end. Clement Lebreu, a guy that played in 1 game last year in his rookie season for Ottawa. S.A. Marabure, a longtime CFL veteran that has mostly fallen into a depth role the past couple of seasons. And then finally Trey Hornbuckle, who played 2 games with the Redblacks last season and registered 3 tackles. He played his college football at Duke. But overall, I think this is a pretty good unit that could, prove me wrong as the season goes along this year. I just don't think that there's that proven #1 pass rusher because Boateng last year, he just didn't prove to be that guy that you can really build your pass rush around that is going to be that unblockable, consistent force on a week-to-week basis. But he could absolutely get that back like he had in 2019, which could raise this ranking up to outperforming where I have them here. Now looking at the rookies on the defensive line, just a couple of guys here. Trayvon McSwain, a 6'6" defensive tackle from Duke. So there's a couple of Duke Blue Devils here in this defensive line room with Trey Hornbuckle joining him. And then Howard Stevens, who played his college football at Shorter College, which is a college that I've never heard of. So, a couple places that I've never heard of. We'll see if any of these guys, or either of these guys, make an impact for them this season. Now flipping to the linebacking core, where I have them 7th in the CFL. And the reason why they're this low, and it's not because of these top two guys. These top two guys are excellent, but who's going to be this third starter in this linebacking core? It's a huge question. Nobody really has much experience at all, and we'll talk about them right now. Starting with Avery Williams, one of those excellent players I just mentioned, who's a pure tackling machine, who is rock solid as a run defender as well. He also has elite closing speed when closing on underneath routes in the passing game. Sometimes he needs to display more of a feel and zone coverage, but regardless, I think Williams is a difference-making linebacker who is this defense's heart and soul and has been this team's best player overall the past 2 seasons. And then strong side linebacker Patrick Levels, a rangy guy with impressive playmaking ability. Sometimes he can gamble a little bit and has taken his fair share of penalties in the past, but it's hard to find a higher upside player at the strong side linebacker position. But then after those two guys, you got a lot of questions about inexperience. So Dwayne Norman, a 4-year CFL veteran that has never really truly broken out with only 4 defensive tackles in 18 career games. Shahid Salman, who's played 17 CFL games across his first 2 CFL seasons, registering 4 total tackles. Before playing in the CFL, he played in the Alliance of American Football in 2019. Frankie Griffin, a second-year player that is likely in the mix to start beside Williams at weak side linebacker after starting 2 games in 2021 with Ottawa. So it's going to be a really big competition for whoever starts beside Williams at that weak side linebacker, and I think Griffin is a candidate to do so. And then Canadian Adam Auclair, who was the team's first-round pick, 6th overall in 2020, and got on the field as both a special teamer and at the linebacker position as a rookie. He's a very intriguing athlete who starred at Laval, and I think he could, depending on what they want to do with the ratio situation, could potentially play a factor in terms of what they want to do there. And then Dan Bassambombo, who played 5 games with the team in 2021 in a reserve special teams type role. Tyron Freddy, a guy that was a 2021 global draft pick, and we'll see if he factors in at all. But overall, it's just literally just that weak side linebacker position is what drags this team down in the rankings, because otherwise, A.V. Williams, Patrick Levels, 2 complete superstar blue chip type players there. But again, when you have one position out of 3 positions, that's really going to drag down your average there. So with that in mind, let's talk about the linebacker rookies that could play an impact here, starting with Deshaun Stevens, the team's first-round pick from 2021 out of Maine, who played last year at West Virginia. He's a very versatile player. I believe he's like 6'4", 250 pounds, so he could potentially chip in at linebacker or defensive line, honestly. So I don't know if he's exactly a fit for any one position on a CFL field, but could be a nice Swiss Army knife piece to have. Jersey Henry, who was originally a 6th-round pick of the Alouettes in 2020 out of Concordia. And then Terrence Smith, a former Florida State Seminole who spent some time in the NFL, most notably with the Chiefs. And then Brian Wright, a 6'3", 238-pound linebacker who played for the Cincinnati Bearcats in the NCAA. Now moving on to the highest rated position for the Red Blacks on defense, and that's the defensive back room, which is going to come in at 4th in the CFL. And I just think this is a good mix of veterans that they have here at this unit. And we'll start with Monchadrick Hunter, a talented but sometimes undisciplined corner that had a true breakout 2021 season with the Alouettes and was one of the league's best boundary cornerbacks. Hunter has good size for the position, which often helps him get hands in passing lanes, and you saw that all the time last year with Montreal, and it was just really one of the better defensive backs in the entire league. But again, just watch out for that discipline that shows up every once in a while. He'll take a really stupid penalty where you really don't need him to. So Honestly, I think that's the one thing you watch out for with Hunter, but he's an excellent player. Otherwise, Tremaine Washington, another guy that had a really good season last year. He played with Toronto in 2019, where I didn't think he looked all too good, and then he went to Edmonton last year, where I thought he was arguably the team's best defensive back on a game-to-game basis. So ultimately a good starter that you are very comfortable with given what he was able to do last year in Edmonton. And then longtime CFL veteran Abdul Kanay, who turned back the clock at points last season, becoming an elite playmaker from his halfback position. He ultimately struggled with injuries throughout the majority of his season, however, only playing in 8 of the 14 games. It's also worth mentioning that Kanay will always be a fan favorite in Ottawa for his role in the team's Grey Cup victory a few years ago. So, he's just a legendary guy that, will for sure start in this defense if he's healthy. And then Sherrod Baltimore, a guy who has had a relatively long tenure here in Ottawa, and one of his career highlights is recording an interception in the 2018 Grey Cup versus Calgary. He's been a solid defensive back over the past few seasons, but is another player that struggled to stay healthy last year. Randall Evans, a veteran defensive back that was often the victim of giving up big plays last year, so he'll definitely have to correct that if he is to earn a spot in this year's starting lineup for the team. He's had some good stretches of play in his career, so we'll see if he bounces back. And then you have the 3 Canadian defensive backs here, starting with Ty Cranston, who spent the first 3 seasons of his CFL career with Montreal and started at safety most of last season. It was kind of a breakout season of sorts for him. His play was solid last season, but I didn't feel he was all too noticeable and made his presence felt all too often. So, it remains to be seen just how good of a player he was. I don't think he was really tested all too often down the field in coverage, but he likely competes for a starting safety job here again in Ottawa, as he was brought in here as a free agent. And then Antoine Pernot, who's the longest serving member of the Redblacks. He was once an all-star safety and one of the best players in the entire CFL. But unfortunately, his play over the last few seasons has been very lacking, often getting beaten one-on-one matchups while also struggling with injuries. He's still a decent spot starter in a pinch, but I think it's possible that he begins this season as a backup. And then another Canadian, Justin Howell, who has seen plenty of playing time over the past 2 seasons and has even started a good chunk of games. And then Ranthony Texada, a guy who has been with the Redblacks organization the past couple of years and has shown flashes of being a good cover guy at the CFL level, but really hasn't broken into that, consistent starting spot yet. And then Trayshawn Abraham, who was the team's 5th round pick in 2020 out of the University of Calgary. And then Jordan Below, another veteran here who has been in the league for 3 seasons, mostly playing at a depth and special teams role. And then the final guy here, Anthula Kelly, who dressed in 3 games with the Tiger Cats last year, but didn't really record any stats or anything notable, so just a complete question mark what he's going to bring to the table this year. Now let's move over to the defensive back rookies, starting with Daniel Valente, who was a mid-round pick in this year's CFL draft by Ottawa out of Western. People really raved about his instincts while playing at the U Sports level, so I'm very intrigued to watch. Then after him, Douglas Coleman, a 6'1", 200-pound defensive back from Texas Tech. Jamon Dotson, originally a standout for the Nevada Wolfpack. He spent some time on Hamilton's training camp roster in 2021, but was ultimately cut. Charles Oliver, a former Texas A&M Aggie who spent some time with the Dresden Monarchs of the German Football League in 2021, so interesting background for him. And then Denzel Rice, who has bounced around the NFL since 2015 and participated in the Spring League in 2021, so a lot of pro experience to bring to the table if you're Denzel Rice. And we'll see if any of these guys make an impact this year. Now let's go on to our final positional ranking with special teams, which they're going to come in at 5th in the CFL, and they take a huge hit here, obviously, with the loss of Devontae Dedmon to the NFL. I mean, you take a huge hit from that, but I think this is still a pretty good unit considering you still have Lewis Ward, who's just a great accurate kicker, very similar to Rene Paredes in Calgary, which is not necessarily dependent on the long range. He's not the guy that's going to go out there and kick a 60-yard field goal, but inside of 50, the 52 to in range, he's just so consistent and arguably the best kicker in the CFL in that perspective. And then punter Richie Leone, who looked really solid again last year in 2019. I felt he was the best punter in the CFL, but I didn't really do a whole bunch of punting analysis, if I'm being honest, for these videos this year. And then at kick returner, I think Ryan Davis may be the guy that they use primarily in that spot this year. So I think he's a guy that could be a guy that excels in that role, but I don't know if he's necessarily going to be that guy this year because of his role on offense, but we'll see what happens with that returning situation now, trying to replace Devontae Dedmon here for the Redblacks. And you put that all together, and the Redblacks are going to come in at 6th on offense and 7th on defense. But keep in mind, again, last year they would have ranked dead last basically in both of these categories. Maybe not on defense, maybe a little bit higher on defense, but ultimately I think this is an extremely improved team from a roster perspective, and I'm really excited to see what they can do this year. Now, speaking of how they're going to do this year, let's take a look at their starting lineups, which we're going to start on offense here. And I'll talk about the main questions here, but first of all, I want to point out what the symbols mean on this diagram here. So the guys that are underlined, those are the guys that I consider maybe they're going to be the starter at that position. It's going to be a potential camp battle for that particular spot. But the guys that aren't underlined, I think for sure they're going to start at those particular spots. So I think on the offensive line, you just have the one question with Dino Boyd starting at right tackle. I had Randy Richards there originally, but I don't know if he's ever going to show up this year, given that he was just placed on the suspension list. And then I think they're going to start one Canadian receiver. They could start two, but I think that with their depth in terms of American veteran receivers, they should be a team that starts 4 Americans and 1 Canadian in the receiving core. I think that's the question in terms of their ratio situation. I think they start the 3 Canadians and the interior offensive line, the 1 at wide receiver. I think it's just a question of what Canadian receiver starts. I think Shaq Johnson is the most likely candidate to start given what he was able to do with BC over the last several seasons, but you could see Nate Bahar or Levi Noel start there as well, so it's going to be a true training camp competition there. And then BJ Cunningham, I think he most likely will start, but I could see one of these veterans really pushing them. And honestly, like with RJ Harris, if he does come back to the team, it's going to be really interesting to see if he can even find a spot in the starting lineup here, because this is a really deep wide receiver room. Now on the defensive side, I have a few more questions for this team. So starting up front on the defensive line, I think they're going to start the 2 Canadians up front with Cleon Lang and Kwaku Boateng, but the other 2 positions on that defensive line I have questions about. Davon Coleman, I think he's going to start, but at the same time, I think he's a guy that could be overtaken if they have an impressive rookie or somebody come into camp and really impress them. And then defensive end Lorenzo Malden, a guy that, like I said, has never really been that starter in the CFL on a regular basis. So obviously there's questions about whether or not he's going to win that job out of camp this year. I could say praise Martin Aguike as well in that spot. So interesting defensive line dynamics there for the Redblacks. In the linebacking core, obviously no questions about Avery Williams at middle linebacker, Patrick Levels at strong side linebacker, but that weak side, I don't really have any idea who's going to start. I put Frankie Griffin in there because he started a couple games there last year, but really a true competition for that weak side linebacker spot in my opinion. And then the defensive back room, I think the guys that are going to start, I don't know why I didn't underline Ty Cranston there. That is a big training camp competition with Cranston, Pruneau, and Justin Howell. I think those 3 guys are going to battle it out in training camp to see who gets that spot. I think Cranston is the most likely to start, though, because they brought him over in free agency. And then Tremaine Washington, I don't know why I underlined him. I think I just mixed up this diagram with him and Cranston, but I think he's going to for sure start in this secondary for the Redblacks. Randall Evans is the guy that I have a question about whether or not he's going to start. He has a bunch of pro experience, but again, like I said, when I talked about him, he struggled last year, and a guy like Sherrod Baltimore could easily start. There's actually just not enough spots for as many veterans as they have here in this defensive back room, so one of these guys is going to end up on the bench or potentially cut for this team. So for me, this is how this team looks in terms of their starting defense, but I think there could be a couple changes here, like those guys I just discussed. Now that leads me to the team award predictions, and for most outstanding player this year, I'm going to go with the basic pick. I'm going to go with Jeremiah Mazzoli. I don't think there's going to be one particular player that dominates this team in terms of like a receiver, or I don't think William Powell is going to have a massive season either at running back. So I think that quarterback is the safe bet. Mazzoli, I think, is going to have a really solid season with that veteran group of receivers around him. Once they start gelling as a unit, they're going to be very good in my opinion. Most outstanding defensive player, Patrick Levels. I think Levels is just a freak and one of the best playmakers from that position in the CFL. He's going to put up a lot of statistics and really appeal himself to voters and the team in that respect. Most outstanding Canadian, I'm going with Kwaku Boateng to have a bounce back season here for the Red Blacks at defensive end and put up like 8 to 10 sacks. That will make him among the most impactful Canadian defensive linemen in the league once again. And then most outstanding offensive lineman, I'm going with Ucombre Williams, but there's other options here as well. I could see Darius Sirocco at center as well as an option, but I'm going with Ucombre. Very versatile, can move into center if this team needed him to, but most likely going to be locking down that left tackle spot where he really excelled last year with Calgary. And finally, let's talk about this team's key question. I just kind of touched on that a little bit a few minutes ago, and how quickly do these new offseason additions gel? There's just so much roster turnover effectively, and I heard this the other day from somebody. I forget who it was. I can't really give them the credit because I forget their name, but they were saying that this is basically an expansion team that had the best expansion draft ever. This team basically signed every big free agent in the CFL this offseason. But we'll see how that strategy ultimately works, how often or how well do these pieces gel together and how quickly do they gel together. Because if they get off to a really slow start in this East Division, which looking to be a much better division than it has been in other years. So I think if they have a slow start to the season, it's going to be a tough road for the Red Blacks to catch up. I think that is the key thing for them this year, starting pretty well and having this delay to training camp with the players' strike. Is not going to be great for Ottawa in my opinion, but by the time this team gets to midseason, I think we're really going to see them hit their stride. And again, I think it's just a matter of time before they ultimately gel as a team. But with that said, that is going to be the end of my roster review for the 2022 Ottawa Redblacks. Be sure to let me know in the comments section what you thought of the video and what you think of this team going in this year. It's a very interesting team. They changed over a lot of this roster, and I think it's an exciting team, and there's just a lot of hope in the air after 2 really down seasons in the nation's capital. But with that said, that is going to be the end of the video, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to thank each and every one of you for watching. Once again, my name is Jason. If you want to support the show, the best way to do it, as always, is by hitting like and subscribe. That's the best way to show your support. And with that said, I really appreciate all your support, guys. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.